All right, welcome back everybody for another edition of the Phya Academy video newsletter. Today we are continuing our exploration into the concept of valor. Hey everybody, good to see everybody. So when we talked about valor last time, we introduced it as a concept that allows us to face danger, right? And the particular dictionary definition of valor, strength of mind, spirit, or character that enables one to encounter danger with firmness, is one of the reasons, is one of the actual foundations as to the positive value of sport. When we think about sport as a physical endeavor, when we think about the physical sacrifices, the physical struggles that are necessary, but also the mental, intellectual, and sort of moral hardships that are also involved in sport, lead us to think about sport as a really excellent place to think about valor, to acquire valor, to display valor, and then ultimately to allow valor to infiltrate our characters and allow ourselves to feel emboldened to face more dangerous situations, maybe off the field or off the pitch. And the way in which sport does this, right, is it forces us into a challenge with ourselves, right? What are we willing to endure? What are we willing to struggle, right? As many of you know, I'm a pretty avid trail runner, and right now where I'm living in Ontario, we're getting the very first snowfalls of the year. And so running in snow is a lot more difficult. It's a lot more challenging than just running on the open dirt. Think about like running in sand. You know how heavy it is, how you have to use far more of your leg muscles and strength in order to push yourself forward. And put on top of that, right, the cold, the wind, the ice, like everything you got to deal with in the winter just means that when I'm out there in the forest on the trails, I'm really in an endurance survival kind of a mode. I'm not going for speed. I'm not going for agility or technique. It's trudge, trudge. How many more steps can I do? How much more of this can I endure? And ultimately, that is sense of endurance, of going through a struggle, of facing a challenge, potentially a dangerous challenge. What does that say about our character? And there's a couple of interesting threads that we can pull together, starting as we do with the ancient Greeks, and then moving through a contemporary example, and then back with some reflective wisdom from those ancient Greeks, the ones who gave us athletic culture and the ideals of athletic heroism. And the Greeks really understood this notion of valor, right? They linked athletic performance with the ability to lead and defend as a soldier and the ability to guide as a politician or philosopher. And the athlete gained this strength, this respect, this commendation in society because of their willingness to engage in a physical struggle and, importantly, to submit themselves to a physical sacrifice. Now, the famous Greek philosopher Socrates himself was a wrestler, and his words here give us a good understanding as to why facing danger in a physical sense may actually be more important sometimes in developing our moral character. I swear upon Zeus, an outstanding runner cannot be the equal of an average wrestler. I feel like Socrates is aiming his directions right at me, just talking about trail running, right? But maybe through my example of trail running in the winter, as opposed to, you know, running on a treadmill or running on a nice smooth asphalt or concrete surface or like a cinder track or something like that, that there is this added element of character building, of character development, of performance, of achievement, of sacrifice that comes from exposure and risk taking. And so when we think about wrestling versus running, like a wrestler is more apt, is more likely to be injured. And Greek wrestling in the ancient world was quite brutal. And it wasn't uncommon for people to be horribly injured and even killed in the ring. But it was this exposure to risk that lent the athletic ideal of the ancient Greeks to acquiring virtue for those who participated. And even those athletes that didn't compete in the combat sports like boxing or wrestling or the pankration, which is basically like mixed martial arts, all Greek athletes had to expose themselves physically, right? We all know that, or we've all heard, or maybe we haven't, that the ancient Greeks competed completely nude, no matter what event they were competing in. So if you were tossing javelin, if you were running in the stad, which is like a 100-meter race, you were exposed. And we can also think about this sense of character, right? When you expose yourself in public and you do not measure up, you do not win, you're risking a tremendous amount of humiliation. You're risking a tremendous amount of your self-confidence, your self-image, right? So inherent in athletic performance, even if we're not taking a necessarily overtly physical risk, there's always this notion of exposure and risk-taking in terms of our character that is almost always on the line. But there are also examples from the contemporary world of individual athletes like gritting their teeth, gutting out extremely impressive performances by playing through pain. And in our first lecture on Valor, we talked about Bert Troutman, right? The famous Man City goaltender who played the final 17 minutes of an FA final with broken vertebrae, with a broken neck. And one of my favorite sports, in fact, my favorite sport, is the sport of golf. And golf oftentimes gets kind of made fun of for its sort of non-physical, non-intense kind of play, right? But for those who have played competitively and played at a high level, they'll know that golf is actually one of the most intense sports. Certainly, I believe to be the most mentally challenging of all sports. But the greatest of all time, that's right, the greatest of all time, Tiger Woods, showed us what golfers are really made of when he gutted out perhaps one of the most inspiring performances of an athlete playing through pain, when he won the 2008 US Open playing on a broken leg. Now, I don't know if you've ever played golf, but if you swing as hard as somebody like Tiger Woods, the amount of torque and pressure that goes onto your knees is extraordinary. So here's a man that had knee surgery a few months before the US Open, and then at the time was dealing with complications from that surgery, amounting to fractured bones in his leg, a fractured tibia. And he ended up having surgery directly after his victory in the US Open. And many people, many observers of Tiger's career actually locate kind of the end of his greatness as a player with this final injury. He has a long history of back and knee problems, but this is the one that kind of put him over the top in terms of never being the same physically. So in the final round of the US Open, every time he swings, it looks like this, because you're playing on a broken leg and you got to walk the whole course. And at the end of the final round of the US Open, he's tied with Rocco Mediate. Now, the US Open is the hardest golf tournament because they make the course conditions extremely tough, and they make it so that the scores are high. That's the sort of the point of the US Open. So if you get into a playoff, in many tournaments, you go to like a one-hole playoff. But in the US Open, you actually have to play a full other round of golf. So he had to come back on Monday, play another 18 holes on a broken leg, and he was able to win that playoff. Incredible. I was just watching some of the final round footage before I was recording this, and I was getting goosebumps. It was inspiring me to watch him hobbling around the golf course, hitting these intense shots with all of the pressure and still coming out on top. An incredible performance. Absolutely incredible. I'm actually at a loss for words trying to describe just how inspiring it is to see somebody who trained so hard and who was so used to dominating his opponents. And then to see him gutting it out in a way that no other golfer probably ever has even attempted to do. Most golfers will easily retire at injuries that are far less severe than this, let alone to win in the hardest tournament against the hardest field. It's incredible. And what I take from this is the notion of effort, the notion of exposure, the notion of risk taking. And I mentioned, right, that the athletes in the ancient Greek world were the soldiers, and there's a strong symbiosis between the athletes and the soldiers in the ancient Greek world. And when we're thinking about this notion of valor, the willingness to face a risk with firmness, there may be no greater legend than this than from Alexander the Great, the famous Macedonian general. Now, at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, this is after a few big victories he's had against the Persians, usually a much larger force. This is kind of like his crown jewel as a general, one of the greatest tactical and strategic victories in all of military history. The legend goes that the night before the battle, Alexander and his generals are sitting around strategizing, trying to think about ways in which they can win. And a lot of the generals, they don't really see a path to victory because the overwhelming might is on the other side. They're outnumbered 2-1. And so they're imploring Alexander, hey, we know where the Persian camp is. Let's go. We can do a sneak attack. We can disorganize them. We can create disunity. We can kill some of them. And Alexander says, absolutely not. We are not going to do that. We're not going to sneak attack. We're going to face them in the daylight, and we're going to march at them face forward. I am determined to attack open by daylight. I prefer to regret my fortune rather than be ashamed of my victory. Now, Alexander was taught by Aristotle, the famous Greek philosopher who we've seen in previous lessons, right? And what's interesting about Aristotle and his connection to athletics is he is an admirer of the athletes. He's an admirer of the Olympic champions, and he really dislikes the professionals who kind of dominate sport at his time. And he has this heroic ideal of the athlete, right, as an emblematic figure of the right types of moral qualities and virtues one should possess. So he is the one who teaches Alexander these important moral lessons that are imbued through sport. And the notion here is fair play, right? Play with honor, play fairly, win with honor, lose with grace. There is no victory. There is no victory in a victory that's won through unfair means. It's not worth anything. It's hollow. And ultimately, that's a lesson in valor. If you achieve without facing the risk, without exposing yourself, what have you really accomplished? By willingly exposing ourselves to dangerous situations and facing them with firmness, like Alexander, we actually gain in moral character. We gain in moral strength. We transfer that ability to face physical danger with the ability to stand up on principle when the times are tough. So what does it all mean? And again, why should we encourage personal valor in our own lives? Well, again, it goes back to those initial questions. What are you willing to endure? And what does that say about your character? The ideal of the athlete hero is that body, mind, and spirit are combined. So when we, in an athletic sense or in a physical sense, run an extra mile when we don't think we can, put on an extra plate on the barbell when we don't think we can lift it, go back out there and face that opponent who we think we don't have a chance to beat. When we conquer those physical challenges, it provides strength within us to then look at other challenges. Maybe it's an intellectual challenge. There's certain arguments, there's certain books, there's certain authors who you're intimidated by. Maybe it's a moral challenge. Maybe there's something going on in society that you think is wrong and you would rather stand up and say something, but the social pressures to conform, the social pressures to keep your head down are too great. And so you don't. The idea of the athletic hero is that we can train ourselves in all of these different areas, but only if we consciously connect them all. And so when thinking about valor and firmness in a dangerous situation, sometimes it's transferring the physical skills that we learn in the gym. Sometimes it's transferring those difficult intellectual battles that we've had and using that as inspiration to push a little farther. This is actually one of the things that I do quite often. I take stories that I've learned about in history, and when I'm out on the trails or when I'm exercising and I feel like I can't go any further, those images, those stories, they pop into my mind. If those people could do it, you can do it. And in fact, they did it in much more difficult circumstances than you. So you should be happy to have the challenge. So I take what I intellectually know and apply it to physical strength. And ultimately, this allows me to have moral strength because I know that all of the challenges I go through intellectually and physically give me the ability to stand firm on my own 2 feet, to feel convicted in my beliefs and my thoughts, and then to have the fortitude to stand behind them and for them. And it may sound cliche, but it's a valuable lesson passed down through the ages that if we simply face physical risks with firmness, boldness, and come through them, that we're going to have transferable strength when we need it in these other areas of our lives. All right. I will see everybody in the next one. I always love seeing your beautiful faces, even though it's a screen. I know they're beautiful out there. See you everyone in the next lesson.